Okay, people, how about if we start, and then others can join us if they wish. Too bad we have a wretched day out, but it's Wisconsin. So let me welcome you all for coming here today. Another one of our Distinguished Peacemaker series, sponsored by the Marquette University Center for Peacemaking. Remember that Louise Kankar spoke, and our friend Jim Douglas spoke, and then Douglas Coots from the United Nations spoke, and our fourth and final speaker in the Distinguished Peacemaker series is our guest today, Rabbi Waskow. So Arthur told me not to tell you everything that he did, because then he wouldn't get a chance to speak. But I'm going to tell you that he did receive his bachelor's degree from Johns Hopkins, and then a PhD in American history from nearby in the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And just reminds me about how much civil disobedience he's done now that I'm thinking about Madison. Arthur's done a lot of wonderful things that have impacted a number of people. He created this thing called the Freedom Seder, which took that kind of archetypical vision of the Exodus and then began to present it as a model or as a way of understanding such things as the Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Movement. He also founded the Shalom Center in Philadelphia back in 1983, I think. And he's still the director of the Shalom Center, which is kind of a prophetic and instructive place. Whenever you should go to the website there, it's fascinating what is coming out of that center. It's theshalomcenter.org. So Arthur is taught at many different universities. One that he's at Swarthmore College. He taught at Temple. He taught at Drew University and Vassar College. Back in 2007 was a big year for you, Art. He was named one of the 50 most influential American rabbis by Newsweek. Also that year, he received the Neighborhood Interfaith Movement of Philadelphia, their Richard Fernandez Religious Leadership Award, and at the same year, Muslim American Society Freedom Foundation presented him with his Peace and Justice Award. And we're proud to have him here as a guest of the Marquette University Center for Peacemaking to speak about peacemaking in the Torah. Please welcome Rabbi Arthur Waskow. I have two other things. I have show and tell here. This is my iPhone, which is to remind me to tell you, please turn off your phones so that they don't buzz or ring or things like that. And this is Arthur and his wife's newest book. I assigned The Tent of Abraham to my class when I taught it here, and it was very well received. This is the newest book, Freedom Journeys, and that's for sale. And I'm sure Arthur, you'll autograph that for us outside as we go out. So, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you. Phyllis, my wife, and I both are alumni of the UW in Madison, and I've rarely been so proud of any place that I was connected with as the two of us have been proud of Madison, its university, its people, you all, the last month or so. So I'm really glad to be in the state of Wisconsin. Shalom. Shalom. Salam. Peace. And you might think I'm saying that tonight because it's very likely that there are Christians, Jews, and Muslims in this room. And that's one reason, but there's a deeper reason. I do it now no matter where I talk, even if it is pretty clearly an audience of all Jews or all Christians or all Muslims. And I do it that way because I kind of remind myself and the people I speak with that, in fact, in every room in which we meet, no matter who seems to be physically in the room, in every room in which we meet in this century, in this generation, all those communities and others besides are present in the room. I don't want us to forget that anywhere. And I'm delighted that, in fact, it may be factually true about this room right now, but it is always true about the rooms we meet in. in our generation of human history. So, biblical roots of peacemaking, especially in relation to Israel and Palestine. 19 years ago, like starting around 1973 or 74, well, I should say, first of all, even a little before that, my first visit to Israel and to the occupied territories, then occupied for only 2 years, and it was hardly anyone who could imagine that that occupation was going to last all this time, was in 1969. And I was both lucky and planful enough to not only to get to visit peace-oriented people, peace-committed people in Israel, but to have them bring me across the Green Line to meet with Palestinians, who said to me unanimously, we are not interested in going back to be vassals of Jordan, which they had been since 1948, and we are totally uninterested in overturning or undoing the state of Israel. What we want is an independent Palestine alongside Israel, and we're ready to make peace. And I came back to the United States, one of very few Americans and very, very few American Jews, convinced that the two-state peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinian West Bank, East Jerusalem, which Israel had asserted it was annexing, and Gaza, was the only way in which there was going to be a decent, long-term resolution of what was then just the bare beginnings of tension. Israelis kept talking that year about how it was such a benign occupation, and it sort of was, only 2 years after the beginning of the occupation. But I was enough of an historian to know no occupation goes on forever benign. It's in the nature of occupations to infuriate those who are occupied, and to demoralize in the deepest sense, take out the morals of the occupiers. So it made total sense that there should be two states. What was new to me in 1969, which was the very beginning, you mentioned the Freedom Seder that I wrote that year, and that was my first entrance into serious Jewish life. From the time of becoming bar mitzvah at 13 until 1968, the Passover, a week after Martin Luther King was murdered, I was living in downtown Washington. There was the Black Uprising in Washington and 200 other American cities. By April 5th, the Army had been sent by President Johnson to occupy the capital of the United States, and I mean occupy, taking over streets, schools, et cetera, et cetera. A curfew had been imposed. In theory, the curfew applied to everybody, but in fact, cops ignored white folk who were on the streets. More than 10,000 blacks were jailed for simply being on the streets. And a week later came Passover. The only piece of Jewish practice I had kept in my life as a grown-up was the Passover Seder. And I walked home to do the Passover Seder past the Army with a Jeep with a machine gun pointed at the block I lived on. And somewhere deep inside my kishkas, my guts, I began to hear the refrain, hardly not from my head. This is Pharaoh's army. You're going home to celebrate the Seder. This is Pharaoh's army on the streets. Dr. King's last speech, I'm standing on the mountaintop looking into the promised land. I may not get there, but the people will. Straight Moses imagery. I had learned, go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land, from Fannie Lou Hamer on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, picketing the Democratic National Convention of 1964. And that Passover night, it all came together in an incredible kind of volcano of energy. And the Freedom Seder in 1969, published in 69, came out of that my first visit to Israel, I was 34, 35. At that point, came out of that. My visit across the Green Line to Palestine, occupied Palestine, came out of that. And by 1973, 4, 5, I was part of unconventional, what Catholics at those times were calling house church, called in Hebrew Chavorah, fellowship, which didn't have a hired rabbi, in which we all shared the process of leading prayer and the process of learning Torah. All of which, in my devious way, I am saying to get to the discovery in that group, that Chavorah, of how to think, a new way to think about the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Isaac and Ishmael. And maybe I'll come back to that, because from 1973 or 4 on until now, recently, that story has really framed my understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I will say a little bit more, actually. There's a very intriguing and rich thread in the story. When God's messengers, English they get called angels, but that's just the Greek angelos, which means messenger. When God's messengers told Sarah and Abraham they were going to have a kid, they laughed. It was ridiculous. They were in their 90s. Sarah didn't have menstrual periods anymore. She thought it was just funny and silly, and so did Abraham. They laughed. Then, what do you know? She got pregnant. They did have a kid. They named the kid, the English sort of transliteration of the name is Isaac, but the Hebrew means laughing boy, Yitzchak. The verb for laugh is tzokek in Hebrew, and this kid they named Yitzchak. Okay. The kid starts growing up, and his older half-brother, Ishmael, is in the household. He is Hagar's son with Abraham. And at some point in their growing up, according to the text, Sarah goes to Abraham and says, it's not going right here. Ishmael is, and again, you got to know the Hebrew, and practically all translations don't do it. Ishmael is, and the word is mitzachek. Now remember I said the word for laugh is tzochek, and Isaac's name in Hebrew is Yitzchak. And now what Sarah says is that Ishmael is doing mitzachek. It's the same root. Laughter of some different kind. In other words, he was somehow semi-imitating the being, the identity of his younger brother. And Sarah says, you got to separate them. So we began to explore what is going on here. What does this mean? Why do they have to be separated? Because Ishmael is like, but not identical? And we read this story. It's one of the two stories Jews traditionally read on Rosh Hashanah, the story that includes the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar. The other one is the story of the almost sacrificing of Isaac, the laughing one, who never gets to laugh from that time on for sure. These two terrifying stories Jews read on Rosh Hashanah make us face, you might say, the worst or the most puzzling or something of Torah. So one Rosh Hashanah in this Chavorah, this fellowship, I handed out about 50 little hand mirrors, so big, right? And I asked people, they all look like, what's going on, Waskow? Crazy. I asked people to look in the mirror. Okay, that's easy enough. And sort of absorb what they saw in the mirror. And they saw their own faces. recognize themselves. And then I asked them to go on the mirror. And of course the mirror is clouded over. And then I simply said, keep watching, and slowly the mirror unclouded, but only sort of a little bit at a time. And then finally got clear again. And I asked people to do that like 5 or 6 times. And then I asked, so what did I feel like? And a lot of people said, it made me feel crazy. Like, I was there, I wasn't there, I was sort of there, I was almost there, somebody like me, but not exactly, was there. And I said, well, I think that might be one way of understanding Yitzchak and Yishmael Mitzacheh. And what has this to do with Israel and Palestine? Think about the two peoples. There are profound ways in which they are similar, though certainly not identical. And their similarities are in fact what in many ways drives both of them nuts. The first similarity is they both say, we love this land, and this land loves us. Each of them says. And then each of them says, this is the second similarity, each of them says, you're lying, can't be true, because I know the land loves me, and if the land loves me, how can it possibly love you? There are other similarities too. It's not for nothing that for many years, many Arabs called the Palestinians the Jews of the Middle East. But think about those two profound similarities and the differences that arise from those similarities. The difficulty of living together if the two peoples are so similar in those ways. So let that just simmer and cook inside you. And now let me pick up a different theme, which I've been thinking about, drawing on, and writing about much more recently. Actually, a couple of overlapping themes. So the Torah has in it, some people say, about 36 times. If that's right, I counted once, it seems to me not quite right, but if you stretch it a little, 36 times, that's a mystical number in Jewish tradition. 18, I mean, it's too complicated to explain all of it, but 18 is a number that stands for life. Maybe you remember in Fiddler on the Roof, l'chaim, right, to life. Well, that word, if you turn it into numbers, comes out to 18. So 36 is double life. About 36 times in the Torah, there is this command, love the stranger because you know the heart of the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It's a profound, serious, powerful teaching. Why is it there 36 times? If I had to tell my kids something that they needed to do 36 times, it wasn't because they were doing it. It was because they weren't doing it. Why would the Torah have to repeat again and again this serious wisdom? You were strangers, pariahs, slaves, outcasts in the land of Egypt. Therefore, treat the outcast, the stranger, the pariah decently. Well, think about it a minute. If you had gone through a couple of centuries of slavery to Pharaoh, to a tyrannical, arrogant, stubborn, hard-hearted ruler, then your first sort of psycho-political response might very well be, nobody is ever going to get close to having the power to do that to me again. And I will use whatever power I can gather to make sure that never happens to me again. yet the Torah says over and over and over, and it seems to me in a kind of compassionate way, yeah, I get it, says the Torah. I get it, that's how you feel. Not wise, not workable, not ethical, and not practical. If you behave that way, in the long run, disaster. And the lesson has to be said again and again and again and again because it's so hard to learn if that's what you've been through. So now jump 3,000 or 4,000 years and take into account the shaping not only of worldwide Jewish identity, but even more, much more intensely, Israeli Jewish identity around the Holocaust. How hard would it be to live by love the stranger, treat the stranger with justice, because you know what it's like to be the stranger. How hard would it be? So I think where that leads me is to both sides of that silent Torah and the spoken Torah. The silent one that says, yeah, I get it, I understand. And the spoken one that says, not that path. Palestinians now have increasingly their own sense, the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe of the expulsion of a very large chunk of the Palestinian community from its homes, from its society, once and then again. And that consciousness, Nakba consciousness, is taking deeper and deeper root in Palestinian culture. Okay. Now I want to turn to a different passage of Torah and give a little background to explain it. According to the book of Exodus, this straggly band of runaway slaves on their way in the wilderness, not knowing exactly where they were going or what they were doing, bump into another community named Amalek, and the community of Amalek, according to Exodus, attacks them from the rear, where the weakest of the Israelites was. The kids, the women, the elderly, the cripples, bringing up the rear, and attack the weakest part of the community. Then, in Deuteronomy, when Moses tells the story of the Exodus all over again, by the way, a very important thing, the Torah is really convinced that telling a story once is not enough. You've got to tell the story over and over again, and Moses doesn't get to be Moses in a way until at close to the end of his life he tells the whole story all over again. Sometimes different from the way in which the Torah has described one very important, the whole description of the reasons for Shabbat, for the Sabbath. Moses has a whole different, according to the book of Deuteronomy, a whole different notion of what went on at Sinai about the Sabbath than the book of Exodus does. But at a late point in Moses explaining to the people what it's going to be like to cross the river, he already knows he ain't going to get to cross the river, and he's not happy about it. He's really pissed, and he mostly blames the people. He says, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey out of Egypt. How he attacked you on the road when you were faint and weary and struck down all who lagged behind you, not fearing God. Therefore, when Yah, Yud He Vav He, most translations say the Lord, and we can go into that, but it's the English, the Western alphabet would be YHWH with no vowels, so it's not Yahweh. The nearest, and for 2,000 years, the Jewish convention has been never to try to pronounce it, but to use the Hebrew that means Lord. And out of that came Kyrie in the New Testament, and Dominus in the Vulgate, and Lord in English. But it wasn't that. Nothing like the word for Lord, this YHWH thing. Nothing like it. I translate it as, you want to call it a translation, YHWH with no vowels. In fact, let me take a minute and invite you, as I often say, if you're going to disobey my grandmother who was teaching me Hebrew when I was 11, and I said, hey, you said to pronounce this Adonai? There's no D letter in it, and there's no N letter in it. It can't be. She said, I know, just do it. So if you're willing to disobey her and 2,000 years worth of rabbis, try pronouncing YHWH with no vowels. It's not Yahweh. It's not Yahovah. They both got vowels. No matter what you were taught in comparative religion, it wasn't them. Try pronouncing it with no vowels at all. Anybody want to share what came up for you? All right, I'll tell you what came up for me the first time I did it. A breath. And two things came to me in the next 30 seconds after I did that. One was, well, sure, at least one of the real names of the real God shouldn't be in Hebrew, or Egyptian, or Sanskrit, or Latin, or Greek, or English, but in every language. Just read. And the second thing that happened in that first 30 seconds was, it's not just human beings. The grass breathes, frogs breathe, trees breathe. And what's more, we don't all, each of us breathe in a little bubble, right? All of us sitting here right now are able to breathe because the trees and the grasses are breathing. They're breathing out the oxygen we need to breathe in. And we are breathing out the CO2 they need to breathe in. So, back to the text. Therefore, when the breath of life, or maybe even the interbreathing of life, that's your God, has given you rest and safety from all your enemies on every hand in the land that your God is giving you as an inheritance. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Now, especially with my insertion of all that stuff about Yah, you may not remember there are three crucial commands here. Remember what Amalek did to you. Blot out the memory of Amalek. Don't forget. Now, is that just crazy? Is it a paradox? Or does it have some deeper meaning? So I want to draw on especially the teaching of Dr. Barbara Brightman, a friend and colleague of mine in Philadelphia, who is herself a psychotherapist and a spiritual director and teaches spiritual directing at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And when we read this together, she said, that's not crazy, that's not a paradox. I do that all the time with grown-ups who have been abused as kids. The first thing is, hey, remember what happened. Get it clear. The second thing is, when you are safe, maybe not blot out the memory, but blur it. Don't be obsessed with that memory anymore. If you stay obsessed with it, what often happens is we know that either people repeat becoming abused or they become abusers. And she says, don't forget either side of this very delicate balance. Don't forget that you were abused, and don't forget that you were in safe territory, and don't be obsessed with the abuse. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because what you might call Amalek consciousness has arisen first in the Jewish people in this last 2 generations. And now, and it turns out, if you look around the world, other peoples, they don't call it Amalek, but this kind of sense of being frozen into the memory of abuse is around. This story and this command were there, but kind of minor in most of recent Jewish life until the Holocaust. When suddenly, Amalek, wow, I mean, Hitler, Nazism, I mean, now there's Amalek for you. The question is, when and how do you get beyond, remember what Amalek did to you, to when you're safe? Blur the memory. Don't be obsessed with the memory. How do you know when you're safe? How do you know when you should no longer focus totally on that memory? And what do you do? What do you do with the memory when you don't want to be obsessed with it? But you also don't want to just forget it. Don't forget. So leaping from the individual abuse psychology to kind of social, communal psychology, what do you have to do? What does the Jewish people have to do? What do or will the Palestinians have to do? What do or will America still, if not obsessed, still really hooked on what happened on 9/11? What do Iraqis and Afghans whose society has been wrecked in Afghanistan several times over by 2 or 3 empires within 1 generation? In Iraq, partly internally, but then utterly wrecked by the American invasion and occupation. What do they do with this? And I don't believe we can get past the Israeli-Palestinian double-fistedness, right? 2 grown-ups with grown-up power, one of them with a lot more. But the Palestinians have shown that in unexpected ways, and not with frontal military assault, but still in ways that drove people crazy, they could bring some kind of power to bear. What do grown-ups who are frozen into having been abused, and you toss them in the same room with each other, and every act of self-defense, as they understand it, that they're taking feels to the other one like a repetition of the abuse? What do you do? Do you turn to an outsider? I mean, people have said, there's no way they can cope with this. The United States of America are going to have to insist, with all its power, that they clear this up. Or, and maybe it shouldn't be or From inside both peoples, does there have to be a kind of renaissance? There are some hints in Jewish religious practice from the distant past about how to get past this kind of obsession. Jews still observe the anniversary of the destruction of the temple, 2 temples, one by the Babylonian Empire and one by the Roman Empire, one of them in 576 before the Common Era, and the other one in 35, I guess. It's about right anyway, of the Common Era. We still observe that anniversary. And we do it by fasting, by mourning, by chanting the Book of Lamentations in a chant that is a lament itself. And we do something else with it. When the Second Temple was still there was a whole tradition that 6 days after the observance of the destruction of the First Temple, there was a day of unmatchable joy. Young women dressed in white dresses, which they borrowed from each other so nobody would notice that the daughter of the high priest had a very fancy dress, whereas the daughter of some peasant farmer had a very plain dress. So all the dresses got mixed up, so you couldn't tell who was rich and who was poor, and who was learned and who was unlearned. And they went out dancing in the fields to choose their husband. The original Sadie Hawkins Day, if anybody remembers Little Abner. I'm not sure what age you've got to be to remember Little Abner. This was 6 days after fasting in memory of the original temple. This day of joy, of marriage, of dancing, of sex. An interesting way to get beyond the obsession with having had your most sacred place destroyed by your worst enemy. After the second destruction by the Roman Empire, the rabbis set up a whole process by which, from that anniversary, in Hebrew, I was going to say festival, but it's hardly a festival, the commemorative day, the fast day, it's called Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av. They figured out that there were 8 Sabbaths between that day and Rosh Hashanah. Excuse me, I said 8? No, 7 Sabbaths. And on each of those Sabbaths, they appointed a celebratory passage of the prophets to be read in the synagogue on each of those Shabbats, moving toward Rosh Hashanah and the renewal of the world and the renewal of the community. And they are called the Shabbatot, the Sabbaths of consolation. And the rabbis seem to have felt that you couldn't just tell people to either just get stuck in Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temple, or just to shrug and walk away. That there had to be time for comfort, for consolation, and then you know, as you do those 7 Sabbaths, that you're moving toward Rosh Hashanah and celebration. So I think these are hints. What does it mean for any of us? We could go back to the individual who has been abused. We could look at whole societies. The Jewish people, the Palestinian people, America, Iraq, South Africa, which may have figured out some ways of getting past the obsession with victimization. What does it mean? Today, on the West Bank and in Gaza, thousands of Palestinians gathered in public, not with the approval of the governing authorities, either in Gaza or the West Bank, to demand the end of the political collision between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and the creation of a Palestinian national government, unified, the government of national unity, that could address the Israeli occupation peacefully, non-violently, not passively, right? Passive resistance is not what Gandhi and King did. It wasn't at all passive. Maybe that's a hint. The celebratory element of nonviolence, which at the same time carries resistance and carries joy, is not hooked on your enemy, but is much more focused on your own profound selfhood. Maybe that's on him. So I want to stop there and just open up to your own thoughts. They can be questions if you feel like it, but they can be your own thoughts, your own responses, your own feelings about these passages of Torah that I've been at least somewhat weaving together.
I think this harboring is just something that we all do. And I think in a sense, it's very hard to let go of. In fact, it's a form of an entertainment. And, I enjoyed the way you put these things. I found it provocative the way you brought it together. How many times the Torah is saying? 36?
Yeah.
And is this something that's perceived in the community?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
your own reading, it's not more general?
Yeah, no. It's we know it's a central teaching of Torah, and it wasn't just Jesus who said, love your neighbor as yourself and all that. That's in the. He's quoted, right? And we know it's there. And one of the great rabbis, in fact, somebody said to him, "So what's the key teaching of Torah?" In fact, said, "Teach me the Torah while I'm standing on one foot." It's a kind of proverb that mostly only Jews know about it. Some Jew says to you, I can't answer that question standing on one foot. Well, that's where you know it comes from. So Hillel answered, don't do to your neighbor what you would find hateful if your neighbor did it to you. That's what it means to say love your neighbor as yourself. That's the whole Torah. Everything else is explanation. Go and study. Which, of course, is a joke. I mean, go and study means standing on one foot. Come on, spend the rest of your life. Go and study. So it's, people have talked about it as so upside down. Some people think maybe even wiser than do to your neighbor what you want your neighbor to do to you, that it may be even wiser to say don't do to your neighbor what you don't want your neighbor to do to you.
Practical stuff.
Is what?
It's a more practical comment.
Right. So yeah, we know it's there, but in the generation after the Holocaust, hard to do. And there are Jews for sure who keep raising that banner, lifting it, reminding us. I just don't think what I've suggested with this whole Amalek discussion is just not enough to raise that banner. Not even enough to read that passage on Amalek and to read it in its fullness. The question is, how do you learn to get to step 2 and step 3? What can you do to get to step 2 and 3? And we can draw on our own. I mean, you said, all of us are into harboring some insults, some
We
oppression.
enjoy it. There's a part of us that enjoys
Right.
it.
So we can also ask ourselves, what has helped us get past that? Because most of us probably live a life where we're not hooked on it. We may even enjoy it some of the time.
Some of the time.
Right. But we might even ask ourselves, what's our own personal experience in getting past it? And can we learn anything from that about how not only Israelis and Palestinians, but Americans and Iraqis and so on can get past, on the collective level, can get past that?
Curious about the parallel you draw between Isaac and Ishmael. And, the covenant is with Isaac, but there's a blessing for Ishmael in Genesis. It's not exactly a covenant. And I'm wondering, in terms of the contemporary situation, it seems among both Israelis and Palestinians that the sense of attachment to the land has been passing from secular groups to religious groups. So the national religious movement in Israel, the settlers, and Hamas among Palestinians. Do you think there is a religious conversation between the two groups that can take place? I was recently, a colleague here at Marquette gave me a link to a YouTube of Rabbi Menachem Froman, who lives in Tekoa. I was quite amazed to see this 12-minute interview of this Orthodox Jew who's been living in Tekoa.
Which means across the Green Line in
across the Green Line,
Palestinian territory.
in part of the Christian movement of settlers, and yet he's talking to Hamas. And I kind of blew me away, and I'm just wondering if you could talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I've actually met Froman, who is, as you saw, a very impressive guy, a very unexpected guy, and very impressive because he's unexpected. Yes, there is dialogue going on. It's in tiny, tiny minorities so far. There have been various versions of it. One version ain't officially religious at all. But if you think about it, it seems to me, I mean, we might use the word spiritual. There's this whole grouping of Israelis and Palestinians who call themselves the Circle of Bereaved Families. Who are they? They are people whose own children or brothers or sisters have been killed by the other side. And you would think, and in fact, for most Israelis and most Palestinians, the emotion that seems to rise is vengeful. And at best, if not vengeful, at least fearful, bordering on rage. The Circle of Bereaved Families say, what's the point? We mourn our dead. And the only way there are going to be fewer of them in the future is if we figure out how to make peace with each other. And they work together to do that. And they don't call themselves officially religious, but that, I think, is a profoundly spiritual way of... In fact, I think there is another Torah text which sort of points in that direction. And it's about the Ishmael-Isaac story. There is a moment when Ishmael and Isaac come together. It's when Papa dies. They've been apart for probably decades, it seems like. And Ibrahim, the most dangerous person in both their lives, dies. And they come together to bury him in the town that's now Hebron. A town named Hebron because it means friend or communal. I said the word chavurah before, fellowship. Hebron is the same word in mostly Arabic, and it's about Abraham being God's friend. So that's where Abraham is presumably buried, and Sarah, and some of the others of the family as well. And they came together the first time, the only time, the Torah calls them Abraham's sons, instead of talking about them in sort of separate paragraphs, is then. And when they finish burying him, Isaac goes off to live at the well that saved Hagar's and Ishmael's life. The well that she named the well of the living one who sees me. So there is a reconciliation, and it came out of both of them mourning together this totally dangerous guy who was ready to kill one of them outright and sent the other one into the wilderness with not quite enough water to stay alive. That's a teaching. If you mourn only your own dead, all you're going to do is get angrier. If you can bear to mourn the dead of the other, then perhaps you can reconnect. And so I think it's funny that I didn't even bring that part of the Isaac Ishmael story, but it's the resolution of the story. And all the stories in the book of Genesis about these angry siblings are reconciled, except Cain and Abel, which is like the teaching story about what happens if you don't reconcile. But it takes decades for them to reconcile, until the last two siblings happens in one instant. But that's why they're the last one. because it resolves the whole. Wait, I could go on clearly. Yeah.
I just had a question about the idea that the central message of the Torah is, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. I got here late, so I wasn't sure if you had covered this already, but I was just wondering, there's so much violence that occurs in the Old Testament, when the Israelites re-enter Canaan and Jericho, so many other tribes are destroyed. And Moses, when he finds out about the golden calf, he orders the men of the tribe of Levi to go into the Hebrew camp and execute thousands of Jews for worshiping this. How do all these violent acts that were justified in the Torah, how can they be a part of the do unto others as you do unto yourself message?
The Torah is an argument. The Torah is an argument among different members of the family about how to live. And the only thing that makes it sacred is that it's the argument. Single lines in it, though Hillel said that one was crucial, sacred. Single lines in it may not be sacred. But they were as ready to argue as Jews or Americans or Palestinians or anybody are today. So thousands gathered in Palestine today to call for nonviolence, and we know that's not the only response Palestinians have had, either to each other or to Israelis, right? The question is, what do you choose to learn from the argument? That's the way I see it, anyway. So I don't view every verse in Torah as standing on its own sacred. I do view the argument as sacred because I know the argument arises again and again and again. And I know I am called to throw my weight on one side or another. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different arguments, but I'm called to throw my weight on one side or another in each of those arguments. You mentioned Joshua, Jericho, etc. First, I want to say, Jericho, if you read the story, is not a violent victory. You might almost call it a non-violent victory. They march around the city 7 times, blowing the ram's horn, and the city walls fall down. I mean, you can call it a miracle if you want, or you can call it, now there's a story that leads up to the story, right? This is the story of Rahab, who's a whore. And she lives on the edge of the edge of the edge of the city. She lives on the edge of the wall. And her name means broad. She's a broad. That's what her name means. And it's her. Joshua sends 2 spies to go check out Jericho, and they are welcomed into her household. And she says, I know you guys are going to win. I mean, look, Pharaoh fell apart. Come on. I mean, it's obvious. You have the force of the planet, the universe, on your side. And I'm willing to hide you here. I want a guarantee that when you guys do win, nobody in my family gets hurt. And they said, sure. And then she says, make an oath. And again, the Hebrew is so... The Hebrew Bible is full of puns. She says, make an oath. And the word for oath and the word for 7 are the same word. And they made an oath that they weren't going to harm her, which means they affirmed some kind of 7-ness. So it's no big surprise when they march around the city 7 times, blowing the shofar, the ram's horn, and the walls fall down, right? Their oath has been a 7 at the same time. All right. But the point is that was a nonviolent victory. But even more important, and I actually was thinking to draw on this as well, even more important. Now, the story of Joshua, the book of Joshua, almost everybody thinks is the bloodiest book of the whole Hebrew Scriptures, right? Many modern scholars say all the stuff in there just never happened. When they do the archaeology on the cities, there don't seem to have been cities where there was mass murder by the invading Israelites, etc. There may have been mass conversions or not even mass conversions, but anyway. So Joshua in the story as we have it, in the Torah, etc., as we have it, Joshua has been told, as heir to Moses, that, hey, this land is your land, our land, right? And God is behind you. Fine. He crosses the river, and then, this is Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 and a little bit more. When Joshua was near Jericho, Jericho hasn't had the walls full yet, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And this strange figure, fully armed and armored, answered, "No! For I am commander of the army of Yah, the breath of life." So Joshua fell on his face on the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What do you command your servant?" And the commander of the army of the breath of life said, "Take your sandals off your feet. The place where you stand is holy." And that's it. Are you for us or for our enemies? No. Considering it's the book of Joshua, considering it seems to be about the invasion and occupation of the land, I think that's pretty extraordinary. And I accept that it's only one piece of the family story. It's only one piece of the argument. It's a piece, obviously, I totally love. During the Israeli invasion of Gaza, I read an essay by an Israeli Jewish, religiously oriented, I'm not sure Orthodox or not, essay, which quoted this story up to the point in which Joshua says, "Are you for us or for your enemy?" And then the writer of this piece says, "So it's obvious, you got to choose." It's clear what he was choosing, and I just flipped out. I said, what an incredibly dishonest way of telling the story. Now, one of the ways in which Jews have done what's called midrash, right, reinterpretation of the text, is sometimes to stop in the middle of a verse and you get some sense of the verse that is maybe 180 degrees or at least 90 degrees different from what the full verse is saying. But that seemed to me just totally outrageous. To quote this story, which seems like a powerful challenge to ultranationalism, as an ultranationalist teaching. So I have never forgotten this passage because of what that guy did with it. And that's one way of my entering the argument, right? No, I ain't going to I'm going to listen to and be outraged by the way you are taking this story, and I'm going to teach it in what I think is its fullness. Yeah.
Do you have time to go back to this discussing Hagar and Sarah?
The discussion of what?
Earlier you talked about discussing Hagar and Sarah. But
I'm still missing the last word.
Sarah and
To wives.
Oh, Sarah. Uh-huh. Hagar and Sarah, sorry. Well, this book that Simon mentioned, The Tent of Abraham, which came out of a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in a group that named itself The Tent of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. The publisher said that was too long a title. It should be just The Tent of Abraham. That book, again, publishers, there are 3 authors named on the title page, right? Sister Joan Chittister quite extraordinary, Benedictine nun, a guy named Saadi Shakur Chisti, a Sufi teacher in Scotland, and me. But there actually is a fourth author, and that's Rabbi Phyllis Berman, who's the co-author with me of this book about the Exodus, and who the two of us have written a couple other books together. And they didn't want to put her on the cover because they said it would unbalance the Jew, Christian, Muslim business. Right? There was one of each. So it would have rebalanced the man-woman. All right, we finally gave up arguing with them. But one of her pieces, I mean, she wrote two really important pieces. One was called How to Pitch the Tent. And the point was how to bring together Jews, Muslims, and Christians in such a way they could actually talk deeply with each other. We had been to official interfaith dialogue sessions, which were totally meaningless. We went to one called in Geneva with extraordinary people from all around the world. And they had these people sitting up in panels talking at everybody about dialogue and never dialoguing. It's crazy. The only dialogues happened at lunch, right? And Phyllis came back from that and said, we ain't going to do that. And she said, okay, what does it mean to do serious connection? First thing is, we're going to start by people talking about their spiritual journeys. Can't do it all. I mean, you get 15, 20 people in a room, but 15 or 20 minutes each, already you get a profound sense of the people. And you get a profound sense of what the religious strand is in their lives. But it's not about, I believe, you believe, we believe. It's about, this is who I am. Second, she said, we're going to break one of the major rules of interfaith dialogue, which is don't try to pray together. It just gets people mad. She said, let's see if we can figure out a way to pray together. In authentic Jewish prayer, authentic Christian prayer, and authentic Muslim prayer, without making people feel like outsiders, but also without compromising the authenticity of the prayer. And we did. And we did. And those two things made all the difference in our ability. So out of that came a book. The other thing she wrote in the book was an essay called Midrash, called Why Hagar Left. It's the last thing in the book. And again, the publisher said they wouldn't put it, they couldn't figure out to put it in the Jewish, though she was doing basically a Jewish midrash. They said, no, this breaks the rules. Not Jewish midrash, not Muslim, not Christian. Going to put it at the end of the book in its own space. What did Phyllis write? She said that when she was 16 or 17 years old, came home to her mother very upset and jealous because the guy who had been her high school boyfriend was getting to be the boyfriend of somebody else she knew, another girl, and she was very upset. And her mother said, where'd you learn that two women should be upset fighting over another guy, over a guy? And she said, oh, come on. You taught me to learn the Torah. I mean, Hagar and Sarah, look, they're doing it right, And her mother said, all right, let me tell you the story that her mother said was handed on to her by her mother, and according to the story, went all the way back to Hagar and Sarah. And the story goes as follows. Oh, I wish Phyllis were here to tell it, but okay, the story goes as follows. That Hagar and Sarah had become really, really close friends. Too long to explain how and why. And as their kids were born, they continued to be close friends. And then Abraham came. No, where is it? Let me get it straight. Right. Abraham came to say, I have had this direct voice from God saying I'm supposed to circumcise the boys. Both mothers, nuts! What is crazy idea? Our two perfect boy babies here. Abraham said, it's straight from God. All right, they said. And they let it happen. Then, years later, Sarah has a dream one night that Abraham comes and says, God just told me to kill one of the kids. All right, that's a very unpleasant dream, but it happened the next night. And the next night, same dream. So she goes to Hagar and says, listen, I don't know what to do with this, but I've had this dream that Abraham says God and says he's supposed to kill his firstborn. And, you know, the firstborn is Ishmael. So we have to figure out what to do. So the two of them cooked up the story that Sarah went to Abraham and said, oh, the kid has been making fun of my kid, and I can't stand it, and they can't stand each other, and they're going to get all messed up if they grow up together, and you got to separate them. They made up the story according to this understanding. They made up the story, which we have in the Torah, is the story they told Abraham. And they got Hagar and Ishmael out of the family. And then, what do you know? God does come, doesn't even bother coming to Sarah. He just comes to Isaac and says, well, you know, God told me to come kill you. So, in the story that Phyllis says her mother told her that her mother told her, Hagar and Sarah wrote down the true story and gave each other the scroll on which they had written it down and agreed that they would hand it on to their daughters, if they had daughters, or their nieces, or some woman of the next generation. And Phyllis says, up through the moment when her mother told her the story, it seems like only women told the story. And Phyllis decided in writing the story down in the tent of Abraham that it was time for men to hear the story too.
Thank you.
Thank Phyllis's mother, or somebody.
Arthur, I have a question. One about back to Israel and Palestine again. I know some of the people, Palestinians, deeply committed to nonviolence and nonviolent resistance to the occupation, and they say that one of the principal things they have to struggle against is fear on the part of the Israelis. Now, one of the Palestinian, Rasuli, I think you might know him, he said that part of that is trained. In other words, that Israeli children are taken to Bergen-Belsen or wherever and said, you know, if you're not careful, this is going to happen to you the same way it happened to everybody else. So that, and he's trying to understand that when the Israeli looks at him as a Palestinian, he sees a Nazi, and so he has to try to struggle with that or against that kind of trained perception of himself and other Palestinians as well. But I'm wondering if you can use any of your resources, Torah resources, Midrash resources, to try to address that fear. I mean, at one level, it's certainly justified. On another level, it's also inculcated and then used. So, what resources can we have to address?
Well, that's the question I raised at the end. That I said I don't yet for sure have an answer to, and I invite all of us to try to think about, not only about Israel-Palestine, but about each of us individually and all of us collectively. What does it mean to get beyond that fear? There is nothing more dangerous than being a powerful victim. That is, carrying around the consciousness of being a victim, but you've got enormous power. Because then you think anything's permitted. Yeah. I'm a victim. I'm just protecting myself. Enormous danger. But you can't unconvince people of that simply by telling them. In fact, Yitzhak Rabin, in his journey up and down to every town, village, and hamlet in Israel, to convince people that the Oslo Agreement made sense, the main thing he said again and again and again is, we are victims no longer. Stop being afraid. And it sort of worked, but not well enough. Didn't work well enough to keep him from being murdered. Didn't work well enough for Israel to stay on that path once he was murdered. So there's got to be more. I think there's got to be a lot of things. I think there's got to be a Palestinian movement which does nonviolence joyfully and keeps coming back to face the fear. And says, we know you're afraid, and we know why you're afraid, and we understand you're afraid. Nevertheless, we are not Nazis, and we are here to show that we're not Nazis. We're not Amalek. And I think it takes Jews and Israelis who create the forms to get to stage 2 of the Amalek consciousness. Blur the memory. Don't be obsessed. And I was hinting, I think some kind of joyful celebration. Some Israelis would say that's what Yom HaAtzmaut is, Independence Day, 10 days after the day of remembering the Holocaust. But Yom HaAtzmaut is set up to be a repetition of the fear, anger, and defense, not a transcendence of it. Imagine the next level of the circle of bereaved families, those families themselves being even more public than they have been, and of creating a celebratory time that they invite people into, which begins with grief, begins with mourning, but not mourning limited to Israelis or to Palestinians, but in which they recite the names of the dead of both communities. And then end by saying we're Passover, and we dance with each other, we celebrate with each other. Imagine twin villages, cities, a kibbutz here and a Palestinian village there, agreeing that they are going to, even if they can't physically afford to eventually get together through Skype, through the internet, etc., they will. And they will share each other's births and marriages and deaths and celebrate together, the two little clusters. Imagine that beginning and becoming a seed for growth. Dot, dot, dot. I don't know the answer to that question.
I have a different, kind of maybe more of a theological angle of one of the discussions that I've had sometimes with, or at least puzzlement sometimes in Christian Jewish dialogue, is the whole question of forgiveness. And many of my Jewish friends are kind of puzzled, or at least taken aback anyway, by the insistence that forgiveness, from the Christian tradition, and forgiveness, repentance is not really necessary for forgiveness. That forgiveness is just plain there, and forgiveness, repentance is important, but not as it isn't a condition for forgiveness, because forgiveness is just the way things operate, at least the way they're supposed to anyway. So I'm wondering if folks are going to talk about some kind of forgiveness back and forth, Israeli and Palestinian, how might that figure? I mean, would you have to say to Israelis, look, before that you can have forgiveness, you have to repent, which seems to be what's being said, and it's not working. And what about to the Palestinians saying, well, you just have to forgive, even though the folks are not repenting. So that whole question of what would probably be, or at least say, I'm sorry, or I'm sorry I did that. That would be a door to forgiveness, at least from my understanding of what a Jewish view of forgiveness would look like. So it seems to be a sticking point for me, and I'm wondering if you could kind of unstick it for me.
Well, the season of what we call the 10 days of Teshuvah, which mostly gets translated repentance, it actually means turning oneself in a new direction, which are the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, it's certainly tshuva, repentance, restitution, returning. That's the dominant note. But slicha, forgiveness, is there. And in fact, the Saturday night, midnight, before Rosh Hashanah, is a whole ceremony called slichot, forgiveness. It's certainly true that Jewish tradition emphasizes that full forgiveness for bad things you've done to other human beings can only come if you redress the bad. You can't just say to God, hey, you was a mistake, and God says, tatsi, tatsi. You got to do something to fix it up. So forgiveness all on its own is not nearly, I mean, people seem to think it's more likely Christians will talk about it, I don't know if they do it more, but talk about it more than Jews, unless the repentance, restitution, redress, all those words comes into play. Interesting, the South African solution was not just reconciliation. It was truth and reconciliation. People were not prepared to reconcile and forgive unless they saw people actually say, okay, this is what I did. This is what I did. And they were prepared for reconciliation after that, but not without it. Is some model like that possible? I don't know. But it's certainly a direction. I mean, it hasn't solved all of South Africa's problems, for sure, but it's been a major direction toward resolution of the big apartheid problem.
Yeah. I want to go back to the beginning of your talk. You talked about the fact that when they were in a safe place, then only then could they forgive and rechange their thinking. And as I see the Arab-Israeli problem, neither side thinks they are in a safe place. And the Arabs think that the Jews want to kick them out, they call it transfer, where they want to kick them out of Palestine. The Jews feel that the Arabs want to send them to the sea. And so the question is, how do you change this conception of what the other side is thinking? And one you gave was the group of reconciliation with the bereaved group. There's another group that's coming to Milwaukee on April 12th called One Voice. And that is where Arabs and Jews listen to Arabs who say, we want to have peace with you. And Arabs listen to Jews saying, we want to have peace with you. So in other words, it's not me telling the Jew that they want peace, but the Arabs themselves telling to the Jews, we want peace. And so I think that kind of people from the other side getting together, it's somewhat similar to the what happened in Northern Ireland, the peace group, where finally the mothers got together and said, we want to get together. And I think that kind of communication, I think, is what I'm,
right.
I think that kind of...
Well, I agree with you, and I agree with the first part of what you said, that both of them think they're unsafe. That's what Rabbi was trying to say to people. You're safe. It's okay. You're safe. You're not victims. You're not in danger. It's okay. You can afford to take the risk of making peace because you're safe. And as I say, he sort of got a part of the way, but not another of the way. And then things went very sour. So what you're saying about the ability to communicate that readiness is important. Public opinion polls on both sides of the border say that both peoples are ready to accept this two-state solution, and the public opinion polls say that each people thinks the other one is not. It's another one of those, similarities that drives you crazy. That Ishmael, Isaac, like each other, similarity that is nutso-making. So you're right. Trying to figure out some way to communicate that with power is important. So the nonviolent demonstrations that are calling for a national unity Palestinian government also ought to be saying we want to end the occupation and we are not interested in undoing the Israeli state, the Israeli society, the ability of Israelis to make their own decision about their own society. I think the people who sort of demand a one-state solution, I think it's a big mistake. I think it makes the Israeli Jews very upset, very frightened. And some Palestinians are not really interested in taking their chances on what a one-state solution would mean either. So, I mean, even if you believe that that would be the best solution, the best I can figure out as a way to get there is the way you get to the European Union. Through and beyond, France and Germany. For 100 years they were at each other's throats. They finally got so deep at each other's throats, they said, this ain't working anymore. There must be some other way and they did it. I can understand how a free Israel and a free Palestine might, a generation later, say, you know what? There's lots we do in fact have in common, and we can in fact share. But how that could be imposed on either people without an incredible bloodbath, far worse than anything we've seen, I don't see. So I think that you're right, that there is a deep need of that affirmation of safety. And what that means for each people is an affirmation that the other one wants it to be free, self-determining, peaceful, etc. And I agree that however one can invent the groups of people who do that in as public a way as they can, it's a step forward.
I'm sure Art will be out there helping by signing books.
Well, wait, Max has a question.
Oh, one more question? Sorry. Max, thanks.
It's more a comment, but especially in terms of the nonviolent peacemaking going on in Marquette, I think that a persistent nonviolent movement where, unfortunately, like blacks in the United States, Palestinians are beaten, and if they get up from the floor, they say, "We still love you." It's like a way to convince Israelis that they're safe. That the impetus for the nonviolence is love of your quote enemy, and that proves safety. Right now in the United States, saying, Israel, you're safe, we're going to keep giving you money, whatever you do, we're going to support you, whatever you do, it doesn't make them feel safe at all. It really is, and it actually doesn't make them safe. It seems to me that a full-blown nonviolent movement supported by most, if not all, of the Palestinians is one way out of this mess. I don't see it that way.
So, Max, you hinted at something which I also want to lift up, and it can be the last thing, but it's important. Most of us sitting in this room, I assume, looks like, are Americans. So does the government of the United States have anything to do with this? You said, looks like, the government of the United States says, hey, whatever Israel feels like doing, we may rumble, but we ain't going to make it stop. So one of the questions is there a role for the outsider? The powerful outsider, the only outsider with enough power and enough sort of moral authority to matter. And what does that mean for Americans? As of now, even the Obama administration is, in fact, following a policy of whatever you do, we'll rumble, but that's okay, basically. It didn't seem like that, it seemed like that might not be the policy for the first maybe 6 months of the Obama administration, but it turned out it is. What does that mean for Americans who care about making peace in the Middle East? I think it's certainly crucial that both the Palestinians and the Israelis turn in some new direction. And it may have to be the Palestinians who begin the process. And I think it will matter if the United States government begins to act differently. Now, how could that happen? I think there's only one way it could happen. If you try to think about what are the constituencies that could make the American government change, there are only two sets of people in the United States who care a lot about the Middle East. One is the oil companies, and the other one is Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Now, as things stand, there is an increasing energy and increasingly well-organized energy in the Jewish community for insisting on a two-state solution. There's an organization called J Street, which affirms a two-state solution and has begun to push. At first it said, hey, we're going to support Obama when he pushes. And now that it's clear he ain't pushing, they are beginning to say, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to push Obama or the next president. The majority of actual flesh and blood Jews in the country does support that. The majority of the institutional Jewish community does not. And the question is how to change that equation. In the Christian world, there are some folks, tagline Christian Zionists, which may be theologically or correct or not. But there are people who, in the Christian world, who are, for what they understand as Christian reasons, are ready to support just about anything the Israeli government wants to do. But the majority of American Christians are not like that. The Catholic Church, at least officially, does work for, no, I take back work. It does speak for two-state solution and peacemaking, Gesundheit. And the majority of American Protestants do. The question is how to bring that energy to bear politically. The majority of American Muslims agree with that. How do we get Muslim, Christian, and Jewish commitment to that solution to have an impact on the United States government? In some ways, the three need each other, right? Every time the Protestants begin to move on this question, the official Jewish community shrieks anti-Semitism, and many of the Protestants back off. So there needs to be a serious hunk of the Jewish community which can say, we agree with this, that makes total sense, and we work with it. When you get anti-Semitic, and it's not so surprising if some American Protestants do, we will tell you. And we'll say that's not legitimate. And we will work with you where it's clear it's not anti-Semitic, and it affirms Israel, and it affirms peace with Palestine. Same thing with the Muslims. The Muslims are scared, for good reason, to criticize any American policy, especially foreign policy, especially Middle East foreign policy, because it's very easy. Well, we always knew they were traitors. Right? So they really badly need serious Christian and serious Jewish allies if they're going to raise this in any serious way. So the corollary to what I spent most of the night talking about within the Israeli and Palestinian communities, the corollary in the American community is that there has to be much more, it seems to me, Abrahamic alliance than is now the case. And that has to begin at the grassroots. And everybody's going to be scared at first. The fear, all kinds of fear, is going to arise. But I do think that's going to be the only way to make a difference. And it may take years. But without it, the American government is not going to change. And if the American government doesn't change, most Israelis will think there's no reason for them to change. All right, now I'm ready to sign those.
Okay, please buy the book.
I love that. Wonderful.